In the upscale neighborhood of Beverly Hills, the night was eerily still, a quiet contrast to the extravagant lives unfolding behind the doors of the mansion on Elm Drive. It was a Sunday evening, the house aglow with the warmth of a family gathering that would never happen. Then, in an instant, everything changed. What began as an unremarkable night spiraled into a mystery that still captivates and divides the nation. Behind those grand doors, a family's fate took a shocking turn, leading to an investigation that would unravel dark secrets, conflicting accounts, and a case unlike any other. Was this a senseless act of violence? Or was there something far more sinister at play? What really happened that night, and why? A mansion filled with luxury, a family bound by secrets, and a night that changed everything. This is Derrick Investigates, and I'm Derrick. Tonight we revisit a case that shattered the illusion of wealth and security, a story that gripped the nation and still divides opinions to this day. In 1989, a prestigious Beverly Hills home became the backdrop for one of the most controversial crimes in American history. The events of that fateful night left behind a tangled web of mystery, deception, and a trial that captivated millions. But was this a calculated act, or was there something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface? Stay with me as we uncover the chilling truth behind the Menendez Brothers case. If the unknown intrigues you as much as it does me, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps us continue unearthing such stories, because some stories refuse to be forgotten. Now, let's step back to 1989, a time of excess and privilege where behind closed doors, a family's darkest secrets were about to be exposed. Lyle and Erik Menendez grew up in the lap of luxury, their lives seemingly perfect to the outside world. Their family resided in an upscale Beverly Hills mansion, a stone's throw away from Hollywood's elite. José Menendez, a Cuban immigrant, had worked his way up in the entertainment industry, accumulating a wealth that afforded his family a lifestyle many could only dream of. His wife, Kitty, appeared to be the quintessential homemaker, devoted to her children, while the boys were bright and well-behaved. To the public, the Menendez family was a symbol of success and the American dream. Yet behind the walls of that mansion, a far more complicated story was unfolding, one that no one could have anticipated. On the night of August 20th, 1989, the peaceful calm of the Menendez household was shattered. The brothers, Lyle and Erik, would soon find themselves in the center of a devastating event that no one could have prepared for. When the police arrived at the scene, they were met with a chilling sight. José, 45, and Kitty, 47, were both found lifeless in their home, each having suffered multiple gunshot wounds. It wasn't a random crime. No forced entry, no sign of a struggle. The scene suggested something far more personal, but what could have led to such tragic violence? The brothers' frantic 911 call, filled with anguish, claimed that they had discovered their parents' bodies when they returned home. However, something about their behavior raised suspicions. While most people would have been overcome with shock and disbelief, the Menendez brothers seemed, in the moments after the discovery, almost too composed. As investigators began piecing together the scene, a nagging question lingered. Did the brothers know more than they were letting on? The brothers' initial statements were examined closely, and immediately, investigators noticed discrepancies. The details they provided about the night of the incident didn't align with the physical evidence at the scene. How could they have walked into such a scene and reacted so calmly, especially considering the tragic nature of the crime? And why, just days after the tragedy, did they appear to be carrying on with their lives as though nothing had happened? Lyle, in particular, raised eyebrows. Despite the tragedy, he went on a lavish shopping spree, splurging on designer clothes, new watches, and even a new car. Erik, meanwhile, seemed to show little remorse for the loss of his parents, continuing with his life as if nothing had changed. The brothers' actions didn't match the level of grief one might expect after losing parents in such a tragic manner. This behavior was at odds with the shock and heartbreak that most people would feel, further deepening the mystery surrounding the case. As investigators dug deeper, they began to uncover more troubling details about the Menendez family. The brothers' relationship with their parents, once considered a typical family dynamic, was now under intense scrutiny. While José was known to be a successful and powerful figure in the entertainment industry, the truth about his relationship with his sons was far darker than anyone had imagined. Sources close to the family began to describe a man who was, in fact, a controlling, domineering figure. José's reputation as a strict father who pushed his children toward perfection was known to a few, but more unsettling were rumors of harsh discipline, manipulation, and verbal abuse. It seemed that beneath the public facade of the ideal family, there was a much darker reality, one that few knew about, and even fewer were willing to talk about. What was clear to investigators, however, was that there was something they had yet to discover. A piece of the puzzle that would explain why two young men might resort to such extreme violence against their own parents. But no one could have anticipated just how deep the story would go, or how the truth would be unveiled. As the investigation into the deaths of José and Kitty Menendez continued, the detectives found themselves grappling with one central question. Was this a random act of violence, or something far more calculated? The brothers' calm demeanor after the killings seemed to suggest the latter, but there were still too many unknowns. As weeks passed, law enforcement continued to search for answers. New evidence was being examined, and every conversation with the Menendez brothers raised more questions. But there was still no clear motive. Were the brothers victims of an unimaginable crime, or were they hiding something? The more investigators learned, the more they realized that the case was far from straightforward. It was a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit, and the solution remained just out of reach. Then, in an unexpected turn of events, a new lead would push the investigation in a completely different direction, one that would shock the public and reveal a truth far darker than anyone had imagined. But for now, the investigators, the public, and even the Menendez brothers themselves were left to wonder what had really happened inside that house on Elm Drive. As investigators continued to probe the circumstances surrounding José and Kitty Menendez's deaths, the picture of a perfect family life began to crack further. Eyewitnesses and family friends, initially in shock, started to speak out about troubling signs that had been ignored for years. Some friends recalled how José had been controlling and emotionally abusive toward his sons. Others hinted at a strained relationship between the brothers and their parents, one marked by tension and discomfort. But what had truly happened that night? The initial suspicion was that this might be the result of a botched robbery or some random act of violence. But the absence of forced entry and the execution-style nature of the killings seemed to rule that out. Investigators turned their focus back on the two people closest to the victims, Lyle and Erik Menendez. The Menendez brothers' actions after the incident continued to raise suspicions. Both Lyle and Erik appeared to show a remarkable lack of grief in the days following their parents' deaths. Lyle, in particular, was seen buying expensive items, going on shopping sprees, and acting as though he was simply carrying on with life as usual. Erik, too, seemed detached, not showing the kind of emotional turmoil one might expect after the violent deaths of one's parents. Initially, law enforcement believed that their behavior was simply a result of shock, but as time passed, the brothers' lack of distress began to look more like calculated indifference. Investigators uncovered that the brothers had also been attending therapy sessions, where they began revealing their struggles with their parents. But the details were murky. Lyle and Erik were now speaking of years of emotional and physical abuse, and allegations began to surface of a much darker secret within the Menendez household. Months into the investigation, the case took a startling turn. During a therapy session, Erik Menendez made a confession that reshaped the narrative. He disclosed, under the guidance of his therapist, that he and his brother had endured what they described as years of mistreatment by their father, José. The brothers alleged that this pattern of control and fear had begun in childhood, leaving them trapped in silence for years. These revelations prompted authorities to take a closer look at the Menendez brothers' claims. While the defense presented accounts suggesting a history of physical and emotional abuse, the prosecution maintained that the killings were premeditated acts of greed. The case became deeply divisive, with some seeing the brothers as victims of long-term trauma, while others viewed their actions as cold-blooded murder. The core question remained: was this a desperate act of self-preservation, or a crime driven by another motive entirely? With the revelation of the abuse, the Menendez brothers were arrested and charged in connection with their parents' deaths. The media quickly descended upon the case, with sensational headlines depicting the brothers as both victims and killers. The trial became a media circus as the world watched closely. Prosecutors and defense attorneys battled over whether the brothers' actions were a result of a deeply traumatizing history of abuse, or whether they were simply motivated by greed and entitlement. The defense argued that the brothers had acted in self-defense, fearing that their father's abuse would continue indefinitely if they did not stop him. They painted a picture of two young men trapped in a toxic and abusive environment, with no escape. Meanwhile, the prosecution took a different stance, focusing on the cold, calculated nature of the killings. They emphasized that the brothers had gone to great lengths to conceal their crime and had exhibited no remorse afterward. Lyle and Erik had not called the police immediately, and they had tried to cover their tracks by taking large sums of money from their parents' accounts. The trial became a high-stakes showdown, each side fighting to control the narrative. Was this a case of two abused sons seeking justice, or a calculated crime masked by a tragic backstory? The jury held the answer, but the world was already divided. As the trial reached its conclusion, the jury was tasked with deciding the fate of the Menendez brothers. The defense had presented a compelling case, showing that the brothers had suffered from years of unimaginable abuse. The prosecution, however, argued that the murder of their parents was far too methodical, too deliberate to be excused by claims of trauma. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Would the brothers be convicted, or would the jury find that their actions were driven by years of repressed pain? The verdict was yet to be determined, but one thing was clear: the Menendez brothers had already been forever changed by the horrors they had endured. Whether they would be convicted of their parents' deaths was still uncertain, but the truth about their lives had been exposed for all to see. As the investigation progressed, the case of José and Kitty Menendez's tragic killings reached a shocking turning point. Up until then, the authorities had been focused on the brothers' strange behavior in the aftermath of the killings. But what initially seemed like a lack of emotion or even guilt was actually something much deeper, something far more tragic. It all began to unfold during a series of therapy sessions. Erik Menendez, under the guidance of his therapist, finally revealed the chilling truth. He confessed that he and his brother Lyle had suffered years of unimaginable abuse at the hands of their father, José. They described how their father had manipulated them, both emotionally and physically over the years, using his power and influence to keep them silent. And even more disturbingly, Erik detailed how the abuse had escalated to physical violence, a reality they had kept hidden for far too long. The revelation was earth-shattering. The brothers' shocking admission that they had been living under the constant fear of their father's violence painted a different picture of their actions. The murders, which had seemed so cold and calculated, now appeared to be a desperate act born from years of trauma and repression. It was clear that the brothers had been carrying emotional scars that ran deep, and these wounds had remained hidden for years. As the details of the abuse emerged, it was hard to ignore the signs that had been there all along: their detachment after the incident, their strange behavior in the aftermath. They weren't just grieving sons, they were survivors of an unspeakable nightmare, and their actions had been an attempt to break free from the torment they had endured. The police quickly realized that they had been missing a crucial part of the puzzle. The case was no longer just about the tragic deaths of two parents. it was about understanding the depth of the brothers' trauma. The investigation took on a new dimension, with investigators digging deeper into the family's troubled past. It wasn't just about the murder anymore. It was about what had driven these young men to take such drastic measures. But the question remained, could the trauma they had endured justify such an extreme act? Was there any way to excuse the deaths of two innocent people, no matter how abusive their actions had been? The line between justice and vengeance began to blur, and the world watched as the Menendez brothers' story unfolded in the courtroom. As the trial began, the defense seized on this new narrative. They painted a picture of two young men trapped in an abusive home, desperate to escape the horrors their father had subjected them to. But the prosecution took a different approach, arguing that the act was too deliberate and well-planned to be simply the result of years of abuse. They focused on the brothers' behavior after the incident, how they had bought expensive items and gone on lavish shopping sprees, seemingly unaffected by the loss of their parents. This contradiction between the brothers' traumatic past and their calculated behavior after the incident became the key focus of the trial. The jury was forced to wrestle with the complex question of whether the Menendez brothers were victims of abuse, or if they were cold-blooded individuals who had taken advantage of their situation for personal gain. What makes this case particularly haunting is that it's not simply about a violent crime, but about the devastating effects of trauma that can echo through generations. The Menendez brothers were shaped by their past in ways that led to an unimaginable decision. But while we may understand the pain and suffering they endured, does it justify the actions that followed? The trial became a battleground for two competing narratives, one of profound trauma and one of calculated murder. In the end, the big reveal, that Erik and Lyle had been enduring years of abuse, did not provide an easy answer. Instead, it left the world with more questions about justice, trauma, and the human capacity for forgiveness. And while the emotional scars of their past may never fully heal, the legal system reached its final verdict. On March 20th, 1996, Lyle and Erik Menendez were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Their appeals were repeatedly denied, and today they remain incarcerated in California's Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility, forever bound by a crime that blurred the lines between victim and perpetrator. Justice isn't always as clear-cut as we'd like to believe. The Menendez case remains one of the most debated trials in modern history. Was it an act of survival or a calculated crime? The courtroom reached a verdict, but in the court of public opinion, the debate rages on. What strikes me about this case is how trauma and violence leave scars far beyond what the eye can see. The mind processes fear, pain, and desperation in ways we may never fully understand. Could the Menendez brothers have seen any other way out, or did the years of suffering distort their perception of justice? Here at Derrick Investigates, we dive deep into the cases that leave the world divided. If this case gripped you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more investigations into the mysteries that refuse to be forgotten. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and always question the truth. I'm Derrick, and I'll be back soon with another investigation.